The first thing I noticed wasn't the peeling paint on the shutters or the weeds pushing up through the brick walkway. It was my son. He was hauling a trash bag around the side of the house in a white t-shirt that had gone grey from too many washes. His shoulders were hunched. He didn't see me standing at the gate. I had been in Canada for 18 years. I stood there with my rolling suitcase on the sidewalk in front of the house I had bought. The house I had signed over to him before I left. The house that was supposed to be his foundation. And I watched my 51-year-old son drag garbage like hired help in his own home. I didn't call out to him. Not yet. I needed a moment. Because what I was seeing didn't make sense, and I needed my brain to catch up with my eyes. Let me go back to the beginning. My name is Opal. I'm 67 years old, and I spent the better part of my adult life working as a licensed practical nurse in Charlotte, North Carolina. I raised 2 children mostly on my own after my husband passed, my son and my daughter who lives in Phoenix. I was never rich, but I was careful. And careful over 30 years adds up. By 2006, I had paid off the house on Whitmore Lane completely. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a sunroom in the back, a magnolia tree in the front yard that bloomed every April without fail. It wasn't a mansion, but it was worth something. A good appraiser would have put it at $380,000 back then. By the time I left, closer to $420,000. My son had just turned 33. He'd had some hard years, a divorce, a stretch of unemployment, some decisions I won't go into detail about here. But he was steady again. He had a job at a logistics company, a small apartment across town, and he'd started talking about getting his life in order. I had been offered a position in Ontario. A long-term care facility was recruiting experienced nurses from the States, offering visa sponsorship, housing assistance, and a salary I couldn't say no to. I was 50 years old, my knees were starting to complain, and I thought, one last big push, save aggressively for 10 years, then come home and rest. I called my son and told him my plan. I said I didn't want the house sitting empty while I was gone. I said I trusted him. I said the house would eventually be his anyway. So why not let him move in and take care of it while I worked in Canada? We went to see a lawyer together. We drew up a life estate arrangement. The house was his to live in and maintain, but the title would transfer fully only when I decided to make it permanent or when I passed. At the time, he seemed grateful. He hugged me at the lawyer's office. He said, "Mom, I won't let you down." I believed him. He was my child. The first few years were fine. We talked every Sunday. He'd tell me about the magnolia tree, about a neighbor's dog that kept getting into the yard, about small repairs he was making. I sent money sometimes, $500 here, $800 there, when he mentioned the water heater acting up or the gutters needing to be replaced. He always said thank you. He always sounded like my son. Then he met Rochelle. I didn't meet her over the phone. I heard about her in pieces. A woman he'd been seeing, divorced, 2 kids from a previous marriage. She seemed nice enough from what he described. He said she was good for him. About 2 years after they got together, he mentioned she had moved in. I didn't love that. It was still legally my house in a sense, and he hadn't asked. But I told myself I was being rigid. He was a grown man. He needed companionship. I let it go. Then the Sunday calls started getting shorter. First it was every other week, then once a month. Then he'd text instead of call. Short messages, "Doing good, Mum, hope you're well." I told myself he was busy. I told myself that's what happens when people settle into a life. What I didn't know was what was happening to my house. About 4 years after Rochelle moved in, I got a call from my daughter in Phoenix. She'd visited Charlotte for a friend's wedding and had driven past Whitmore Lane just to look. She said, "Mama, when did Marcus add a garage?" I said, "He didn't tell me about any garage." She said, "Well, there's one there. And there's a truck in the driveway I've never seen. And some woman's name on a mailbox plaque." I called my son that evening. He told me Rochelle's brother Darnell had been staying with them temporarily, that the garage was just a carport they put up themselves, nothing structural, that everything was fine. Something in his voice told me it wasn't. But I was 1,200 miles away. I was working double shifts. I told myself I'd look into it when I came home for Christmas. Then something came up at work. Then Christmas passed. Then another year went by. That is the part I am not proud of. I need to say that plainly, because the people I love deserve honesty. I let too much time go by. I told myself it was distance. I told myself it was money. The truth is, I was also afraid of what I would find, and so I found reasons not to look, and that silence was the door I left open. By the time 14 years had passed, I was 64 and ready to come home. I had saved enough. My nephew's demisons were still valid in North Carolina. My body was tired in the way that only night shifts and hard winters can make you tired. I told my son I was coming. He said, "Great, Mom, we'll get your room ready, your room, in my house." I noticed the phrasing but didn't say anything. I flew into Charlotte on a Tuesday in October. I took a cab from the airport because I didn't want anyone fussing over me. I wanted to arrive quietly, see the house with my own eyes before announcements were made. That's when I saw him through the cab window. My son, in that grey t-shirt, hauling garbage around the side of the house. I paid the driver and stood at the gate. The magnolia tree was still there. That was the first thing that comforted me. But the front porch had a different set of furniture on it. Heavy wooden stuff, not anything I recognized. There was a wind chime I'd never bought. A wreath on the door that wasn't mine. The mailbox had been replaced. The plaque on it said, R&D Fulton. Rochelle's last name was Fulton. I knew that much. But who was Dee? I rang the doorbell. A woman I had never met opened the door. She was maybe 55, heavy-set, hair pulled back. She looked at me without smiling. I said, "I'm Opal. This is my house." She looked me up and down. Then she turned her head and called into the house, "Darnell." Not my son's name. Darnell. A man came to the door, big, mid-40s, wearing a polo shirt with a property management logo on the chest. He looked at me with an expression that was somehow both polite and dismissive at the same time. He said, "Can I help you?" I said, "I'm looking for my son." He said, "He's out back." I walked around the side of the house without waiting for an invitation. My son was still at the trash cans. He turned when he heard me, and his face did something complicated. Surprise, then relief, then something that looked almost like shame. I hugged him. He hugged him back. He felt thinner than I remembered. I said, quietly, "What is going on in there?" He took a breath. He said, "Mom, it's a long story." I said, "I have time." The long story took all afternoon. After Rochelle moved in, her brother Darnell had come to stay for a few months following a job loss. A few months turned into a year. Darnell was charming, apparently, and he and Rochelle had convinced my son that having a third adult in the house meant shared expenses, lower bills, easier upkeep. What actually happened was that Darnell, who worked in property management, began to take over. He renegotiated the utilities into his name, saying it was simpler for billing. He convinced my son to let him handle the property taxes, offering to set up automatic payments from a shared account. He started making small changes to the house, the mailbox, the carport, new locks on the back door, always with a reasonable-sounding explanation. Somewhere in year 3 of Darnell's temporary stay, Rochelle told my son she wanted to refinance the house to consolidate debt. She needed his cooperation because the life estate still had my name on it. My son told her that wasn't possible without contacting me. So they contacted me, or rather, someone did, using an email address that looked almost exactly like mine, one letter off, and using my son's name. The documents that came back, documents purporting to be my consent to remove the life estate restriction, were forged. I never saw those documents. I never signed anything. But by the time I arrived in October, Darnell and Rochelle had used those forged papers to take out a $200,000 home equity line of credit against the house on Whitmore Lane. My house had been used as collateral for money I never agreed to lend. And my son, my quiet, too trusting, conflict-avoidant son, had watched it happen and hadn't known how to stop it. I sat at the kitchen table in my own house and I listened to everything my son told me. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. When he finished talking, I said, "Are the documents with the lawyer still in the filing cabinet in the hall closet?" He said, "I think so." I said, "Go get them." He brought me the folder. I looked through it. I looked at the forged consent form with something that had my name on it in a signature that was close but not mine. The loop on the P was wrong. The final letters trailed in a way I don't trail. I excused myself to the sunroom. I called my attorney. His name is Harold, and I have worked with him for 22 years. When he answered, I said 4 words. "Harold, they forged me." What happened after that was not quick. I want to be honest about that, because the way these stories sometimes get told, it sounds like justice arrives in a neat package within the week. It doesn't. Harold filed an emergency motion to challenge the validity of the HELOC on the grounds of fraudulent documentation. A forensic document examiner was hired to analyze the consent form. The email chain used to submit the forged papers was traced through a discovery process that took months. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg police were involved. The State Bureau of Investigation became involved when it was clear the fraud had crossed state lines. Darnell had been using the HELOC funds to finance a side business he operated partly out of Tennessee. During those months, I stayed in the sunroom. Darnell and Rochelle were not immediately removed. That required its own legal process, and so I lived in the same house as the people who had stolen from me. I cooked my own food. I kept my door locked. I was cordial when I had to be, and quiet the rest of the time. My son stayed too. He cooperated fully with the investigation. He sat with the detective for 3 hours and gave a recorded statement that covered everything he had witnessed over 4 years. The gradual takeover, the pressured signatures, the moments when he'd objected and been overruled or talked out of it. He cried during part of that, I was told. He should not have let it go as far as it did. But I have been his mother for 51 years, and I know the difference between a man who participated in something and a man who didn't know how to fight back. My son is the second kind. He's always been the kind of person who avoids the fire until the house is already burning. That's something we'll work on, but it is not the same thing as what Darnell and Rochelle did. Darnell was indicted on 2 counts of forgery, 1 count of financial fraud, and 1 count of financial fraud, and 1 count of identity theft. Rochelle was charged as a co-conspirator. The HELOC was voided. The lender, after initially resisting, settled out of court, acknowledging their due diligence process had failed to catch the fraudulent documentation. Part of the settlement required Darnell and Rochelle to repay the funds they had drawn against the credit line. They had spent approximately $140,000 of the $200,000 available. The settlement required full repayment plus fees. Their attorney negotiated a payment plan, which means I will be receiving checks for a number of years rather than a lump sum, but the obligation is legally binding. They were also both required to vacate the property within 30 days of the settlement. I watched them load a moving truck on a cold Friday in February. I stood in the doorway, my doorway, and I did not say a word. I did not need to. After they left, my son and I cleaned the house together. We painted the sunroom. We replaced the mailbox with a plain black one that has no plaque on it. We threw away Rochelle's wind chime. We had a long conversation on the back porch one evening that covered things we should have said to each other years ago. About how I left. About what he needed that I wasn't there to provide. About how we had both let silence do damage. Those conversations are ongoing. We're not done with them, but we're having them, and that's more than I can say for the 14 years I was away. The magnolia tree bloomed in April, right on schedule. I was there to see it. I want to say something directly to anyone watching this who might be in a situation like my son's, living under the same roof as someone who has slowly made you feel like a guest in your own life. The water getting turned up so gradually you don't notice until it's scalding. The decisions getting made without you until you've forgotten you had the right to make them. That is not a personality conflict. That is not a difficult relationship. That is abuse. Financial abuse is real. Domestic control is real. And one of the reasons it works is because it moves slowly and it is carried out by people who are very good at making the slow things seem normal. If something feels wrong, it probably is. You do not have to be able to explain it perfectly to a detective or a lawyer or your mother before you're allowed to say that something is wrong. Say it first. Figure out the rest later. My son is doing better. He is still in the house on Whitmore Lane, and we are figuring out what the future looks like for both of us. He has started seeing a therapist, which took me asking him directly twice and then leaving a business card on the kitchen counter. I'm not above that kind of gentle persistence. I am back home. My nursing license is reinstated. I am working part-time at an outpatient clinic 2 days a week, enough to stay useful, not so much that I forget to sit on my own porch. Last week, I made a pot of gumbo and my son ate 3 bowls. He said it was the best thing he'd had in years. I believed him. He's my child, and some things no forgery in the world can take away. I've had a lot of time to sit with this story, not just the legal part, the part that came before, the 18 years of distance, the Sunday calls that got shorter and shorter until they were just texts. I've had to be honest with myself about what I contributed to what happened in that house. Here's what I know now that I didn't fully understand then. The people who took advantage of my son didn't walk in one day and announce their intentions. Darnell didn't show up with a plan typed out on paper. It started with small things, a name on a utility bill, a suggestion about paperwork, a slow rearranging of who was in charge. That's how this kind always works. Not in a moment, but across hundreds of small moments, each one just reasonable enough to wave through. And the reason it worked as long as it did is that my son is a person who keeps the peace. He always has been. When he was 12 and his sister took his baseball cards, he let her keep them because he didn't want the argument. That boy grew into a man who said yes when he meant no, who stayed quiet when he should have spoken, who told himself the situation would resolve on its own. It didn't. It never does. I don't say that to shame him. I say it because I recognize that quality and I recognize where it comes from. I spent 18 years telling myself everything was fine at Whitmore Lane because looking closely felt too hard. We were both practicing the same avoidance, just in different rooms of the same problem. What Darnell and Rochelle did was wrong. It was criminal. And the law said so, plainly, and I am grateful for that. But the conditions they exploited, the silence, the distance, the long habit of not asking the hard question directly, those were ours. That's not guilt talking. That's just honesty. What I've come to believe, after everything, is that the people who cause this kind of harm are counting on one thing above everything else. That you won't look. That you'll be too polite, too tired, too far away, too afraid of what you'll find. The moment you look, really look, without flinching, is the moment their power over the situation starts to dissolve. I stood at that gate in October and I looked. That was the beginning of the end for them. My son is learning at 51 years old what it feels like to say what he means in real time. It's uncomfortable for him. He told me recently that he'd said no to something at work and his hands were shaking afterward. I told him that means he did something hard, not that he did something wrong. The shaking goes away. The habit of speaking up builds the same way any habit builds, one uncomfortable moment at a time. For me, the lesson is simpler and harder at the same time. Being away is not the same as being released from responsibility. I provided the house. I provided the legal structure. And then I went 1,200 miles away and told myself that was enough. It wasn't. Love requires showing up, and showing up requires more than a phone call on Sunday. We're both doing the work now. That's the part I want people to take from this. Not just that the bad people got caught, though they did, but that the people who were left standing looked at what they'd allowed and decided to do it differently. That decision, made honestly, without excuses, is what I'm most proud of. That and the gumbo. Always the gumbo.